Speed paint, contrast paint, espresso color, instant color, all of these magical new paints are in a bit of a weird spot because they are the coolest things since sliced bread, but they're also kind of a lie, or at least an overpromise. The promise is a one-coat painting solution. With one big sloppy brush stroke, you can get your highlights, base coats, and shadows done in one step. And this is kinda sorta tentatively true, but there's a lot more to it than that. This stuff is usually aimed at beginners, and that's kinda fair, but I think you can take contrast paint and speed paint and all of these other paints a lot further. But it takes a little bit of work. These two paints are both greens, and looking at the labels, they're about the same color, but actually, they aren't. Speed paints are transparent and hyper-saturated, which means that they can never really cover what's underneath. They just change the color of what's below them. Where opaque paints don't change the color, they cover up. You can control how many layers you do to get more or less coverage and therefore saturation, but you can't change the color. Contrast paints are really color tints, and I would argue that real contrast paints are only the colors that look almost black in the bottle. Could you tell me what colors these were from looking at the bottles? One is a dark blue and the other is a dark brown, but that almost black color tells you something useful about the paint. These are the colors that I find really versatile, because when using them, you can get something that can go from a very light green to an almost black green and everywhere in between. Compare that to this Bad Moon's yellow. This is a great paint, but it can only go from a yellow to a slightly more saturated yellow. It's not going to be the one-coat solution that's advertised. This magic trick has led me to buying a lot of colors and then experimenting to find out what these colors are actually like. Also, I don't find much difference between paints sold as washes and paints sold as contrast. There must be some difference because Games Workshop sells different mediums for these paints. Contrast paint medium is a transparent white goo, and their wash medium is a slightly more transparent white goo. I use these interchangeably, and I've used up multiple bottles of both of these with no noticeable difference in my painting. Because I can't actually tell what the paint's gonna look like by looking at the label, it's more important to be able to see the paint in front of me to tell what it's gonna do to my minis. This is my collection of speed paint and contrast paint. The fat GW pots are in a paint rack, and the speed paints are in a Lazy Susan. To help me see what the paint actually looks like on the GW pots, I use peel and stick name tag to give me an example of what the paint looks like, and on speed paint bottles, I painted the caps white and then put a layer of speed paint over top. Without tricks like these, I don't know how anyone can actually tell what paints are in their collection. Now the pitch for speed paint and contrast paint is to slap these on and call it a day, or you can get fancy with it, use these as a base coat, and then do more real painting on top. But I actually think these colors are way more versatile than they get credit, and to prove that, I need a mini. And that brings us to today's sponsor. Digital Extremes, creators of the third-person action shooter Warframe. Also, I prefer third-person because I play all games as RPGs, and so I like to see my character. They've sponsored this video, and you might be thinking to yourself, Jay, that's a video game. They made minis. These 70mm minis are from the game's newest update out now, Warframe 1999. They're cyberpunk ninjas, and it's also kinda cute that the proto frames are on such distinctive 3D printed frames. I have all 6 of the original proto frames: Arthur, Aoi, Letty, Amir, Eleanor, and Quincy. And these tall minis are not something one would typically see as wanting to get speed painted. Softer, more realistic details are not something speed paint is known for, but maybe it should be. All 6 of these minis are available as free STLs, and you can find them linked below. I'm gonna paint Aoi, the second in command of the proto frames, the ninja with a thing for origami, gigantic wrist blades, and telekinetic powers. And I'm gonna be using nearly only speed paints, but in a very different way. First, she needs a base. I actually like how the 3D printed raft looks, so I put down a layer of texture paste and then sprinkled on some sand and pieces of kitty litter, the hobbyist's rock, and locked it all in place with ultra thin superglue. Now, to take advantage of speed paint's transparency, zenithal is smart, but not necessarily always a white zenithal. Whatever color is underneath will show through on the final product. Aoi's suit is blue, so I want to spray a light blue from above. I went over her head and shoulders with a little bit of white paint to make sure that these parts end up being the brightest part of the model. Now for some base coats, and speed paint from the bottle is how these colors are meant to be used, but I find thinning them about 50-50 actually leads to a better outcome. After thinning this color, I quickly base coated her legs, doing one even thin layer, not letting the paint pool but just tint. Another fact about speed paints is that you need to shake the bejesus out of them, and when they're on your palette, you need to give them a stir every time you refresh your brush. The blue hasn't covered up any of the undercoating, just tinted, and now I can make the tint more saturated by doing more layers. I painted more and more of this color between her legs, under her knees, on her ankles and feet, and this takes a lot of layers, but it's really easy to see what's happening. With opaque paints, because you're covering your previous layer, it's easy to go too far. But thin transparent speed paint layers are so subtle that you can't really make any big mistakes. Now that I've reached full saturation on my blue, I switch to a darker blue, thinning it down and applying my shadows. I can still see my zenithal under the paint, so I can follow that as my guide to where these paints should go. With the blue done, I need to pick out a warframe with a blue-green, and I know the blue is going to show through, so I need to use a green to make a line of blue-green running down her legs. For her flak armor, I took a black speed paint, thinned it down, and then base coated her front, and I used an army green in her harness. On both of these colors, I made a little mistake. Because speed paints get more saturated as you layer them on, I can never go back to how bright the zenithal was. I could really use some white paint. I'm painting up my little proto framer, and the contrast paints are doing what contrast paints do, and that is tinting. But some of my details are getting a little bit lost in darkness, and so I would like to bring up the value of some of these colors, and that should be easy to do because I have white contrast paints and speed paints. However, these don't work that way because white contrast paint and speed paint is a lie. Contrast paints are transparent, but white contrast paints, number one, they're not white, they're gray, but they're opaque. It's a trick. This is a completely different thing to regular contrast paints, and they don't behave at all like regular contrast paints. If I apply these paints to my playing card, it doesn't tint the previous layer, it hides it. It behaves exactly like opaque paints. The only way to make these colors do the contrast thing is to put them over a pure white base coat, and even then, it mostly just turns whatever you're painting gray. Since speed paints can't brighten, I have to cheat in some more brightness using opaque paints. I thin down some ice yellow and layer this over top of the parts I just painted. If I had thinned my colors a little bit more during the base coating, I could have kept the brightness from the zenithal, but it's still pretty easy to treat the model like I'm painting it in grayscale. I painted on my whites and then put my contrast paint back over it, this time properly thin so it tints the color without darkening it. I reapplied my colors very thin so I could really control the saturation, and this is what speed paint is great at, layering. Now it's time to paint Aoi's warframe, and her frame is kind of this metal coil that wraps around the outside of her catsuit. And to do that, I would like to do something a little bit different so it stands out from the rest of the model. And for that, I'm kind of feeling like reaching for a very weird speed paint product, and that is metallics. These also don't obey the laws of speed paint. These colors are much less egregious than the white paint. They're black, yellow, and red speed paint with just a little bit of glitter in them. They don't do the base coat shade highlighting thing regular speed paints do. They're more like an extra flowy saturated metallic. I used a paper towel to wick away some of the speed paint from my brush so that I could put it on a little bit more precisely. I used the silver color on Aoi's arms, making sure it was less saturated on top of her arms and then doing multiple coats on the bottom to get full saturation. Now she has silver weapons, but they look a little dead. I would like to introduce some color, and speed paint does nothing but introduce color. I glazed yellow over the silver to tint it and then switched to an orange to make the shadows more vibrant. This yellow and orange next to the blues and greens helps these spots stand out strong. I even used orange on her military green harness. Over the green, it darkened and desaturated, letting me pick out the details. These are the sort of discoveries you make with these weird paints. I got this fire giant orange in a big old paint set, and I haven't touched it once because I don't use a lot of oranges. Turns out, this color is a really interesting shade for green. Huh. I think I'll be using it a little bit more often. Painting with contrast is all about shading without highlighting. I used a beige red, thinned down a lot, and did many layers. Hitting her forehead and jaws a lot to make these spots darker and more saturated, and leaving her brow and cheeks and nose alone to stay bright. For her eyes, I had to reintroduce white paint so I had something to darken. Aoi has telekinetic powers, so some mysterious glowing eyes feels appropriate. After a few glazes of blue, she has a very magical stare. After her face, I moved on to another detail, the patch on her armor. I base coated it with some thinned down tan contrast paint, then I painted a heart using my dark blue speed paint. Then I layered on lots and lots of layers of tan, going over the edges again and again and again until some patches of dirt started to form. Now Aoi's almost done, the only thing left is her hair, and as we know, white speed paint is a lie, so to get white the only way is with white paint. I highlighted her hair and then went back to my speed paints and contrast paints to give her punky blue bangs. I used speed paint a lot for basing. I took 2 earth tones and painted the base in a few big patches. I've got Aoi just about done, and she's looking very cold. And that might be kind of lower accurate, but I want to introduce a little bit of color. And contrast paints and speed paints are really good at introducing because they're transparent, so they don't cover anything, they just tint. And that means they work really well through the airbrush. Right now, Aoi has white even top light, but I want to set her in a more cyberpunk setting. I found a magenta, thinned it down and threw it into my airbrush, and I sprayed this on from below to her left side. This tints every color on the model slightly warm and rosy. From above, I sprayed on a yellow to land on her hair and shoulders, and from the right side, I sprayed on a jade colored paint. These 3 colors work together to tint any leftover paint from the desaturated zenithal and makes sure that she's vibrant everywhere. And it helps to sell her as a ninja in a cyberpunk setting. Speed paints and contrast paints are awesome, but a bit tricky to buy because it's hard to tell what they actually look like. My favorite colors I've discovered is the trifecta: Noble Skin, Grim Black, and Occultist Cloak, a warm black, a black, and a cold black. Citadel Eldari Emerald and Imperial Fist are ultra mega vibrant colors, perfect for tinting. Citadel Gargax Sewer is a really great leather brown, and the only brown I like from Games Workshop. And Army Painter Gillydew is the color of sci-fi. I use it every time I need to paint a screen. Owie, my proto frame, is done. Even trying to stay as lore accurate as possible, I was able to achieve it nicely. A 70mm model using only contrast paints and speed paints is done. And not once did I use the product as intended. I did not use it as a one-coat solution because that's one answer to a very broad range of questions, and you're only gonna get that one answer. And sometimes that answer is appropriate. I have not worried about painting boots or pants since these products were invented. I one coat of paint on there and I get them as done as much as I care to get them done. But if you just mess around with the paints and use them not as intended, they become really, really interesting. Hard things like glazing and blending become really, really easy. And it might take a few more layers, but each of those layers is so non-destructive that you can really see what you're doing. I really, really like these paints. If any of you guys have a collection of speed paints and contrast paints, I highly recommend take a model and try to paint it exclusively with these paints so that you can discover the absolute weapon you have in your painting toolbox. I don't exclusively use contrast paints and speed paints, but ever since I've added these to my painting projects, I feel like everything has turned out a little bit better and a little bit faster. And don't forget about the game Warframe. They have 70 million players and a new update, Warframe 1999, out now, featuring the proto frames who are available as free STLs, linked in the description. Thanks for watching.